Hi there, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. My name is Rachel Schrader. I'm PPMD's Vice President of Clinical Care and Education, and I'm happy to have with me some wonderful speakers today from Santhera Pharmaceuticals who are going to share with us some updates on the Vemorlan drug development pathway. So we have Shabir Hasham, who is the Vemorlan Global Program Lead, and Jody Wolf, who is the Head of Global Patient Advocacy at Santhera. I know that we're all very much looking forward to hearing these updates. Please keep in mind you are able to submit any questions you have for our speakers through the chat function, and we'll get through as many of those questions at the end of the hour as possible. Without further ado, and to waste no more time, I'll go ahead and turn things over to Jody Wolf. Jody?
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having us here today, and thanks to PPMD for hosting this webinar. I am Jody Wolf. I am the Head of Patient Advocacy for Santhera Pharmaceuticals. I'm here today with my colleague Shabir Hasham to provide an update on our Vemorlan development program for Duchenne. This is our forward-looking statement, which just reminds everyone that there's no guarantee that any of the research or projects described will succeed and that any new products will be brought to market. This presentation is for educational and scientific exchange. So Santhera has its headquarters outside of Boston. Our global headquarters are in, just outside of Boston, Basel, Switzerland. We are focused on the development of innovative treatment options for rare and neuromuscular disease, and we've been working in Duchenne since 2008. Our lead program is investigating Vemorlan as a potential foundational therapy and mutation-agnostic therapy for a broad segment of the Duchenne community. We licensed Vemorlan from the company Reverigen in September 2020. Reverigen is responsible for carrying out the Vision DMD clinical trial, and Santhera is working closely with them to prepare that trial for readout in the second quarter, so in the next few months, and to conduct analysis on the data already collected in the phase 2A study and the long-term extension of that study, as well as plan for future studies and regulatory activities to develop this investigational therapy. Santhera is ultimately now responsible for the program, and we're actively transitioning the program to us with Reverigen. The Santhera team has been working with the data only since January, so we're going to give you an overview of what our current thinking is around the safety and efficacy of Vemorlan at this time, as well as a sneak peek of the vast amount of data that will further inform our thinking throughout 2021. And we hope to bring you on this journey with us, and we'll share our learnings with you throughout the process. So let's start by discussing the use of corticosteroids, or just steroids, as many of you call them, in Duchenne. So as you all know, steroids are an important part of the standard of care for Duchenne, but they do have limitations. As you can see on the right, steroid use tends to peak between the ages of 7 and 12 years old, with about 80% of boys using corticosteroids. And then that kind of tapers off as your boys get into their teen and adult years. This is usually related to the side effects of taking steroids, or your perception of benefit changes over time. And regardless, this data, which is from the PPMD Duchenne Connect registry, is very consistent across multiple registries and natural history studies. And you can see the data really supporting that decrease in steroid use over time from the PPMD registry. So the investigational therapy Vemorlan has been designed to offer the benefits of steroids for hopefully a longer period of time. And with Vemorlan, we hope to retain the benefit of steroids, but to decrease the side effects that cause so many of the boys and men to discontinue using steroids. We anticipate that Vemorlan can be used in boys with Duchenne regardless of mutation, alone or in combination with other therapies. It's a flavored syrup that's taken once daily with a glass of milk to aid absorption of the drug. So why do corticosteroids, work so well in Duchenne? There is strong evidence that inflammation plays a critical role in the progression of Duchenne. We see inflammatory changes in the muscle of infants with Duchenne from the time they're born. We also see the abnormal persistence of macrophages, which is a type of white blood cell that removes dead cells and stimulates the action of other immune system cells. And we also see the infiltration of these inflammatory cells in Duchenne muscle. You can see that on the right-hand side here. Steroids are impressive anti-inflammatory medications, and they suppress the innate and adaptive immunity danger signals like NF-kappa B. They also are potent in their ability to change the transcription of the genome. They bind to the glucocorticoid receptor and activate about 10% of the genes in your genome. So what does all this activation talk mean for boys with Duchenne? Now, the adverse effects of steroid use, both short and long-term effects, are common in boys with Duchenne. And this slide shows the frequency of these side effects from two large studies, one done by Luca Bello in 2015 and another published by Brenda Wong in 2017. So we see rates of 76% of boys having compression fractures in their spine, 65% experiencing weight gain, close to 40% experiencing behavior changes, growth failure and delay, bone mineral density loss. We see long bone fractures. 55% of boys have a cushingoid appearance, which is just the puffy face. So a lot of side effects there. So the question becomes, in therapeutic development, can we uncouple the benefits of corticosteroids from the side effects? Can we retain the benefits like improvements in strength and mobility, prolonged ambulation, prolonged arm function, preserved breathing, delaying or avoiding scoliosis altogether, while decreasing the severity of or the occurrence of the side effects that are commonly experienced? So vamorolone is an investigational molecule. It's been engineered to do just that. It's a dissociative steroid. It has a different chemical structure than corticosteroids. And because of that different structure, it binds differently in the cell and activates less of the genome. So, like steroids, we believe vemorlan can inhibit NF-kappa B activity and that it gives the benefits of steroid and its anti-inflammatory properties. It addresses the inflammatory response in the body, which we know is chronic and overactive in boys with Duchenne. But vemorlan acts differently on the glucocorticoid receptors, and that causes the side effects of steroids. So potentially, because vemorlan acts differently, we hope that can result in significant reductions of the side effects of that we see with corticosteroids. And this is what we're studying now. So, to walk us through the phase 2 data that we have so far and the long-term extension data, I'd like to throw it over to my colleague and head of the vamorolone development program, Shabir Hisham.
Thank you, Jody, and thank you to PPMD for this opportunity. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the tremendous work that has been done by Virgin, but not only with Virgin, but also PPMD and many of the community who backed this program. We're in a very fortunate position that the program is very comprehensive and we have a lot of data to work with. And what I want to do is just to give you a flavor of where we're going with that data and what we hope to see in the longer term. So some of you may be aware, others may not, that there are several trials that have already been completed with Vemorlan. We started with a phase 1 PK study back in 2015, and that actually studied Vemorlan up to 20 milligrams per kilogram. So we have a good idea in healthy volunteers of the safety and tolerability of Vemorlan. And based on that, there was a phase 2A study, which was a 2-week study looking at 4 ascending doses, and we'll talk a little bit about that. what happened was that they were on drug for 2 weeks, and then there was a 2-week washout, and then there was an extension study where the same patients at the same dose were kept on drug for 6 months. And that was a bridging study. We were trying to bridge the PK data, the safety data to some early clinical outcome measures. And then those patients in the 2A extension rolled into a long-term extension, which was 2 years. And there was a little bit of change in doses, and that's really where the story becomes very interesting. In addition to that, we have the phase 2B pivotal study, the Vision DMD study. As Jody indicated, we're hoping to get the top-line readout out soon. We have several publications if you're interested, and so as we go through this presentation, of course, we won't be presenting all of the data. I would invite you to go through the papers if there is interest. Thank you, Jody. Okay, next slide, thank you. So as we move through the program, going from an early phase 2A, bridging to clinical, and moving on to the 2B pivotal study, of course, our interest is to see what changes occur in the functional outcome measures of interest. Time to stand velocity, time to stand is the primary outcome measure in the Vision DMD. It has also been for the 2A program. We also are looking at North Star, time to climb, time to run, walk, the quantitative muscle testing and the 6-minute walk test. So again, the usual parameters that you see generally in trials. In addition, because our interest with Vemorlan is not only just to profile the efficacy, we also want to take a much deeper look into the safety profile. The program was designed in a very robust manner from the very early stages to look at safety biomarkers. So we look at adrenal axis suppression. We look at bone turnover, insulin resistance, and there's a whole heap of other exploratory biomarkers of inflammation and other safety measures that have been incorporated into the program. So again, we have a wealth of information to look at. Next slide, please, Julie. And so what we try to do here is to give you a summary by dose of what happened in the program. You remember I told you that the 2A study, the 002, was a multiple ascending dose study for 2 weeks. That's what you see on the left-hand side. The doses ranged from 0.25 all the way up to 6 milligrams per kilogram. Don't forget the phase 1 study actually went up to 20. So we chose a range that we believed was the best needed to be studied to characterize the dose response. And that study also had quite a few biomarkers. They were washed out after 2 weeks and then went into the 003 study. So the same patients at the same drug dose went into the 003 study. And that really was a 6-month study looking to bridge some of the knowledge we had from the 02 study to more clinically relevant outcome measures that I mentioned before. Those patients then went, sorry, one second. Go back, yeah, thank you. After the 6-month period in the 003 study, those patients then went into the 2-year extension. And this is where patients on the lower 2 doses, the 0.25 and the 0.75, were then escalated to either the 2 and 6, and in some cases were actually given 4, and then we'll go through a little bit of that in the next few slides. And so what you'll see is we're gradually building our knowledge in terms of a dose response, bridging to clinical outcome measures, and then really focusing on what we think are the 2 interesting doses in terms of the benefit risk, but also hopefully, if we get approval, what we anticipate to be the doses. And so that is the 2.5-year LTE program, the 003, that we'll touch on in a little bit as well. Thank you, Jody. What is different about the 2A program at this stage of development is that we have a long follow-up period. We have 2.5 years of data, which is a blessing at this stage of clinical trial development. But in addition to that, we also have a lot of data at the 2 and 6. But as we know, the interest being safety focused, what we're also able to do within this program is to look at changes of doses. When patients went into the long-term, 2-year long-term extension, physicians were able to adjust the dose based on clinical judgment and in agreement with Reverigen medical monitors. And so what you see is that from the 2 lowest doses, all patients were then put onto either 2 and 6, and there were some adjustments. And what that really allows us to do because now we've characterized the dose response and the dose safety response, we can actually start to also look what happens when there have been changes in doses to see whether a side effect is still there, if it's not. Now, bear in mind the numbers are small, but it gives us a lot of information to try to learn as much as possible. Next slide, please, Julie. And so this is really what happened over the 2.5-year period. As I've said again, it's a very long period for this stage of development. Of the original 48 patients who were in the 002 study, 46 went into the 003 study, and the 2 patients who weren't able to go in went off study because of non-drug related issues. One went into another trial, and the other one had disease progression and therefore stopped. Of the 46 that started the 003 study, 41 actually maintained within the study for the 2.5-year period, which means that we had about an 89–90% retention rate. Those of the patients who discontinued early, 3 went to other trials. 1, as not as uncommon, found the study to be too burdensome, and 1 was the disease progression I mentioned earlier. We have half of those who were on the 2 high doses were maintained throughout the study on the 2, so half of the 46 in total. And the other half, of course, changed dose and went up and then adjusted, as we mentioned. Thank you, Jody. And so what I want to do is just give you a flavor of some of the outcomes at the 6-month, at the 18-month, and we'll talk a little bit about the 13-month time point. The 6 and 18-month data are in the public domain. Of course, you're welcome to look at the papers for more detail. In the time we're given, we can't give a very comprehensive review of each paper, but I just wanted to touch on some of the key points that help us in terms of the way we think about the data. Next slide, please, Jody. At the 6-month time point, what we're really looking for is a dose response. And in this analysis, again, it's just one of many analyses, what we see is clearly a difference between the high dose and the low dose. And this is really what we want to see as we continue to build the knowledge base around how the Malarone works. Now, you'll see that the 2 and the 6 behave slightly differently depending on which endpoint you look at the 6 months. Again, it's a very early time point in a very small sample size, so that's not really the purpose. It wasn't powered to be able to detect differences at the dose level. So really what we were only looking for is to see that there was a difference between the 2 and the 6, and that was achieved across all outcome measures. Next slide, please. Oh, I can't see the next one. Yeah, there we are. And again, that's fine, Julie. Well, yeah, if we go one forward. Yeah, thank you. And again, what we see here is the same difference between the lowest doses and the highest doses in the 6-minute walk test. And again, we need to take these data within context of a small study that isn't really powered to look at individual doses. So again, it gives us several measures where we see a difference between the 2 highest and the 2 lowest doses. Next slide, please. At the 18-month time point, what we see is, and is a summary table of the whole paper again, and these are looking at changes from baseline to month 18. And what we see are statistically significant differences between baseline and month 18 of each of these functional outcome measures. Now, the paper does do some additional analyses. It compares it to Synergy Natural History, untreated and steroid treated. And again, I would welcome you to look at the paper. But really what this is doing is, again, confirming maintenance of treatment effect. We're seeing either an improvement or stability of disease, depending on the age of the child and the stage of where they are in the study. And again, this is just building up on the evidence base that we see in the 6-month, now at the 1.5-year, 18-month time point period. Next slide, please. And so really where we're at now is that the 30-month data has been collected. We're now in the process of analyzing the data. And so what I wanted to do was just to give you a flavor of some of the thinking we have so far. I must say that these are preliminary data. It's just very recently started in terms of a project to do a very deep analysis. Bear in mind that there's a lot of ways that we can cut the data with the dose changes, and what we really want to do is to see what the relationship is with the dose exposure and a side effect, and if you change doses, whether there's a change in the side effect profile, to allow really physicians and yourselves to understand how to optimally use the Malarone should it be approved. Next slide, please. So the first thing we wanted to do is we wanted to look at the data in a slightly different way. You've seen the analyses of the 18-month and the 6-month data. They clearly show that there is a difference between the two doses. What we wanted to do was to take this a little bit further, take it one step further. Now, what happened was that the patients who were on the 2 and 6 milligrams per kilogram at the beginning of the 03 study stayed on until the end of the 2.5-year period. And those who were on the lower doses escalated to either the 2 and 6 after different time periods. And so what we were able to do was to look at the effect of starting on a high dose and then comparing it to the low dose and seeing what happens when that low dose group then switched to a high dose group. And this is quite a common way to look at data for this type of disease and this type of drug. It is called the delayed start analysis. What you see on the top line is those patients who started on the high dose and maintained the high dose. And what you see on the bottom black line is the period of the low dose, and then the red line subsequently when they started the high dose. And what you see very clearly, as we saw in the 6-month data, was there was a difference between the low dose and high dose in terms of functional outcome, improvement in the high dose. But interestingly, what we see, and again, these are just small studies and small numbers, so please, I have to caution you to take this with a pinch of salt. But what we see here is that once you've switched from the low dose to the high dose, you see either an improvement or stability in function, which is in keeping, again, with the treatment effect. We know that switching from a low dose to a high dose will have an effect. We've seen that in the early 6 months. But what we now see is a maintenance of that benefit over a 2.5-year period. So what you'll see is that those who were originally on a lower dose and then switched to a higher dose never catch up to those who started on the high dose. And this is really in keeping with what we understand about the disease process and how the drug should work. So again, we're building up more and more evidence and understanding of how to really look at these data. Next slide. I should bear in mind that these are just preliminary data, and we're expecting a lot of new data to be coming out in the near future, and we can talk about that perhaps in the Q&A. I know there's a lot of interest in terms of safety. This is, again, a preliminary safety table that was presented at the NDA Congress. Maybe we can just talk through some of the highlights. In terms of the effect of steroids, we saw no signal at the moment of immunosuppression. We're not seeing any dose-related signals of increases in infection. We're not seeing an impact on growth. So children entered the study in around the 30th percentile of growth, and they maintained around the 30th percentile of growth at the end of the study. And so growth was not stunted. We see some common infections, but then these are in common with the background rates, and there's no dose dependency. So these are the usual upper respiratory tract infections that we see in children. We see some GI disturbance, but the question we often get is what happens to weight? And of course, weight is an important thing to look at for steroids. So we do see a slight dose and time-dependent increase in weight, but we need to be careful about how we interpret those because these boys are growing compared to those who are on traditional corticosteroids. And so we are currently looking at the effect of growth as well as the effect of the Malarone in terms of increasing weight and trying to figure out which is attributable to which. And so that's something I would just caution you in terms of when you look at these, making an immediate interpretation. Some of it will be because boys are growing, and some of it will be perhaps a dose and drug-related increase. Even so, 75% on the highest dose of 6 milligrams tolerated the drug very well. Only a quarter experienced drug-related weight increase or height-related weight increase. We'll have to wait and see what that looks like. We only saw 2 cases of Cushingoid. We saw no cases of hirsutism. And very minimal increases in terms of behavioral changes, about 4% of the overall population. So again, very low compared to current knowledge with steroids. And so really taking this all together, we're now at a position where we're increasing in confidence in terms of our understanding of the drug and its dose relationship to efficacy. We've seen clear separation between low dose and high dose. We've seen maintenance of effect at 18 months, and now we've seen maintenance of effect at 2.5 years. So that's all heading certainly in the right direction. The safety profile, we believe, is different to current corticosteroids. I will say at the moment preliminary data, but we are undertaking a lot of analysis with the safety data. We're certainly seeing lower rates of adverse events of interest that are usually related to corticosteroids than we should expect. And so the next step really is to continue analyzing the data. We hope third week of April to early May, we'd like to make some public announcements about more definitive data and analysis. Of course, we're also looking at the relevance of changing doses and seeing whether that could also help alleviate some of these safety signals. So that's a point of interest as well. And really with that, it's just to thank you. Of course, none of this could be done without your support. And just to say thank you for that support. Jodie, I'll hand it back to you.
Great. Thanks, Shabir. As you know, we still have a lot of questions to answer about Vemorlan, and that's what we're hoping to do in the Vision DMD trial. So let me walk you through that. This is a pivotal study, which means we hope to use the data to submit for approval to the regulators in the U.S. and in Europe. There are 121 boys in the trial, which completed enrollment in September. The last patient completed their last visit this past month in February. Boys in the Vision DMD trial are needed to be 4 to less than 7 years old at the start of the study, and they were assigned randomly to one of 4 groups. 25% of them received the 2 mg per kg daily of Vemorlan. 25% received the highest dose of Vemorlan being studied, which was 6 milligrams per kilogram daily. 25% received the standard dose of prednisone at 0.75 mg per kg daily, and the last 25% received placebo. This section of the study lasts for 24 weeks, so there are 2 treatment periods of this study, 24 weeks long. Then during a 4-week transition period, the boys on prednisone and placebo transition to either 2 or 6 mg per kg daily doses, and that's randomized. Those already on that dose, they stay on the same dose for another 20 weeks. The study is taking place at 33 sites in 11 countries. We will have 2 readouts of data, one for the first treatment period of 6 months and one at a year. We expect the first 6 months of data in Q2, so at some point in the next 3 months, since March is already almost behind us. The primary outcome measure of the study is the velocity of time to stand, or how quickly the boys are able to rise from the floor. We'll be testing for many other things, though, and that includes weight gain. We'll be looking at the 6-minute walk test, the North Star ambulatory assessment, the 10-meter walk-run, and all boys who complete the trial are eligible and will be offered for treatment under an expanded access program. And that expanded access program is only for the boys in the phase that have participated in the Vemorlan trials at this point. Our timelines in the U.S. right now, first cut of data, Q2, the 48-week data in Q4, so at the very end of the year, and if the data is compelling, an FDA submission in the first quarter of 2022, so a year from now. The Vision DMD study will also investigate bone health. We know that the impact of steroids on bone health is of great concern to parents and patients with Duchenne, and a side effect of steroids is osteoporosis, which causes bone fragility. So long bone fractures, like those of the femur during falls or transfers, that can lead to early loss of ambulation, hospitalization, and vertebral fractures in the spine can result in chronic pain. So in collaboration with Dr. Leanne Ward's team In Ottawa, they are evaluating the effect of vamorolone compared to prednisone on markers of bone health. And there will be central readings of spinal x-rays. They will look at the total body composition, lean and fat muscle mass, and many other tests. First and foremost, we'd like to thank the families participating in the trials for their commitment to the study, even during a global pandemic. We worked with the FDA, I should say ReVerogen, who is conducting the trial, worked with the FDA to agree to and implement modifications in the study and to be able to conduct remote assessments of the time to stand endpoint. And we will conduct statistical analysis to account for any changes related to COVID in study data. So we're going to look at those remote assessments and compare them to those that were done in person. And ReVerogen has the ability to deliver the investigational drug during COVID to study participants at home, as well as delayed scheduled in-person visits if needed. So we do hope that through these measures and others that COVID will have a minimal impact on the study, but we will we'll have an active discussion with the FDA. So in summary, Santhera, we've been in Duchenne for a long time. We continue our strong commitment to the Duchenne community. Steroids are the standard of care in Duchenne, but they face limitations due to side effects. So Vemorlan is being investigated as a first-in-class dissociative steroid thought to have anti-inflammatory effects with lower incident of corticosteroid-associated adverse events. The phase 2A study provides evidence of functional improvements or stabilization in participants at 6, 18, and 30-month time points. And the pivotal phase 2B study is ongoing. There's a 6-month readout coming up. Expected application to the FDA in the first quarter of 2022 based on that data. And 12-month readout at the end of the year with European marketing authorization application expected in the second quarter of 2022. With that, I would like to thank all the families who participated in the Vemorlan trial and contributed to the investigation of this therapy that to this point has been led by ReVerogen. And these groups have supported various aspects of the development program. We are happy to take questions. I see a number of them coming through the chat right now. So I will throw it back to Rachel. And it is possible that our head of development may be on the line. I'm not sure if she was able to join, but that's Sabine Pilo, who oversees our development programs. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jody, for all of this information, and to Shabir. This has been really helpful and insightful, and we certainly do have lots of questions. But I think we'll start with one from the very beginning on slide 6. I think that it would be helpful if perhaps you all could dive into a little bit further the actual term dissociative steroid. So we think about corticosteroids, glucocorticoids, prednisone, Emflaza. How is a dissociative steroid different from steroids that we think about typically? Maybe Shabir, you could just provide just a little bit more color around that terminology.
Yeah, sure. I know it sounds like a complicated concept, but actually it's quite easy. So steroids have really two main actions. One is thought to be on the NF-kappa beta pathway, which is the inflammatory pathway, and it inhibits that. But it then also activates certain gene transcriptions, which means that it switches on certain genes, quite a few genes, 10% of your genome. And by switching on those genomes, it then causes many of the side effects that we are trying to limit. So simply put, Vemorlan is structurally similar to a steroid, but it's chemically altered in one bond. And that one bond is enough when it binds to the receptor to have the anti-inflammatory effect, but have little effect in terms of gene transcription. And that's really what you're seeing translated into the better safety profile. And so what it does is it dissociates the anti-inflammatory action, which we want to keep, from the gene transcription process that we want to try to reduce as much as possible.
Wonderful. I think that's really helpful. I think that our community is just so resilient when we think about all of these new and challenging terms that we have to learn. And so this is just another one that I'm sure will be old pros when it comes to talking about dissociative steroids in no time at all. So as we think about vamorolone being this dissociative steroid and having, a different safety and side effect profile, I think one of the things that we're seeing really in the questions that are coming through and just in conversations is really that around weight gain. Obviously, that's a huge issue that we see with other steroids that people living with Duchenne experience. So I don't know if you could perhaps elaborate a little bit on what the weight gain patterns have looked like so far from these preliminary readouts. One of the questions that we got specifically was there an improvement in that increased weight following dose reduction from 6 milligrams to 4 milligrams per kilogram in that one patient who did decrease to that 4 mg per kg dose?
Thank you. I think that's a great question, and it's a question we get asked very often. And so what I can say is, based on the information we have at hand, the weight gain tends to happen at the highest dose of 6 milligrams per kilogram. It seems that it affects somewhere about a quarter of those on the highest dose, so 3/4 are actually doing quite well in terms of weight. The thing that's difficult to understand at the moment until we do more work, and that's really the focus of the next 2-3 weeks, is to understand whether part of that is the growth aspect and what is therefore not growth. And once we understand that, it'll give us some insight. Now, those who were changing dose, so I'll give you an example. So, a majority of those who started at 6, actually all of them stayed on 6 for the whole study period. So those who tolerated it very well early didn't experience the growth, the weight increase. The weight increase happened when it went from 2 to 6 in 2 subjects, and they were then down titrated either to 4 or back down to 2. There's an excellent question I saw in the chat. Does this result in a change in weight? The numbers are very small, and probably the time period isn't long enough to be able to see that clearly. But we are certainly looking at that kind of pattern. And so it's a limited weight gain. We still need to try to understand how much of that is the growth trajectory and how much of that is something else.
That's great. Is that something that we might be able to see a little bit more in detail with that Q2 report that you're going to provide here in the next couple of weeks to months?
So it's our intention. Obviously, it's important data that we get asked a lot, and we'd be able to do that. So that's our intention.
Wonderful. All right. So we've got a few questions that are coming in that are all kind of around the same theme regarding access of vamorolone for people outside of these initial age ranges. So maybe you could clarify first the ages of boys that were included in the clinical trial, and then talk about any plans for access for people who are younger or older than were included and how that might translate into a potential FDA approval.
Sure, I'm happy to take that. The clinical studies were done in boys ages 4 through 7. And the FDA has, and we'll see the confirming data in the second quarter in that age group. The FDA has typically provided a pretty broad label to therapies for a broad range of neuromuscular diseases. We'll need to have a discussion with the FDA after we see the 4 to 7-year-old data from Vision DMD. And, some of the kids in the expanded access program are pushing 10 years old now. But it's too early to comment on a label in the U.S., and those discussions will happen a bit later. But as part of our European submission, we are required to do smaller safety studies in the kids under 4 years old and the kids older than 7. So we're actively working on the design of those studies, and the PPMD team guidance will certainly be sought in order to make those the best, most patient-centered trials that we can. So there are additional studies, but then we'll have to see what a label looks like in the U.S.
Great. That's super helpful, Jody. Thank you so much. Okay, let's see. Here's a really great question that came in from a mom. I think it gets really tricky when we see those different terms that are listed out in the adverse effect reporting. Could you just clarify for all of us on the line what you mean when you list out nasopharyngitis as an adverse event?
Sure. So nasopharyngitis, it's upper respiratory. It's a cold, a common cold, not a flu. So it's inflammation of the upper airways.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Severe. I think that it gets really tricky. We see things like pyrexia, and folks like you and I know that means a fever, but I think it's tough when you're a parent. You might not know some of those different medical terms. So I appreciate that clarification.
It took me 11 years. It took me 11 years to learn it, so I totally understand.
Like I said, we've got one resilient community. We'll learn the language. We just need some time to get familiar with those tricky terms. So I know that this is very much a forward-looking question that I'm going to ask next, and so it might be difficult to provide too much insight on it because we're not there yet. But the question reads, once approved, would Vemorlan be available for all DMD patients despite age, or those who are not naive to steroids, such as prednisone, deflazacort, and what would transitioning from a traditional steroid to Vemorlan potentially look like? And I know, like I said, that this is very much forward-looking, so it might be a little bit tricky to sort of navigate the response.
So maybe I'll take that question, and it's a fantastic question, so thank you for that. As an organization, our ambition is to make Malarone, should it be approved, available, obviously, to the wider population. So we're not just thinking about young boys, 4 to 7. We're obviously thinking about a broader age range. At this time, we've got to focus really on those who perhaps are experiencing difficulties on other steroids and want to switch. That's certainly one area of focus. We're thinking about how to negotiate with the regulators. I think later will be perhaps older boys at a later stage of disease. Obviously, there are benefits in terms of lung function. So we're actually in discussion with the European regulators specifically as part of the PIP, Pediatric Investigational Plan on that. And we'll also see really what negotiations look like with the FDA and how broad they may or may not go. Once we understand that in the next, before the end of the year, I think we can probably update you with a bit more information.
Wonderful. And this next one, actually, I'm going to refer back to our conversation earlier today, Jody and Shabir. We talked a little bit about potential indications outside of Duchenne, outside of dystrophinopathy. Have there been any conversations or plans about Santhera potentially exploring a wider level of access to Vemorlan outside of the dystrophinopathy indication?
So the answer is, in short, yes. We are interested in looking outside of Duchenne. I think at the moment, we're just focusing on just getting the submission done, and then we'll really get onto the work of other avenues shortly after approval.
I do want to add to that, Shabir, that Revergent has an NIH grant and a study designed for Becker muscular dystrophy. We do know that that in Becker, it tends to be the more severe phenotypes that use steroids just because of the safety profile of being on long-term, chronic, high-dose steroids. And so they're going to look at Becker muscular dystrophy more in depth. So that's the next disease and population of patients that's queued up.
That's great to hear. I know that we'll be really anxious to see some initial data from that. That's really wonderful news. Sort of along that same line, as we think about people with Duchenne who are older, so people in their 20s, people in their 30s living with Duchenne who maybe took steroids when they were younger, maybe they didn't. And I think, this question really looks to steroid use as a whole, but perhaps even more focused with applicability to Vemorlan. Do we have any data to suggest that perhaps it would be beneficial for someone who is older, perhaps somebody in their 20s or 30s, to consider taking a drug like Vemorlan?
I'm happy to give that a shot. Shabir, if you want to
go ahead.
Chime in. So I mean, when kids with Duchenne in the 80s and 90s were put on steroids, it was really that short-term bump and boost that they were getting from the steroids to keep them ambulating longer, and then typically they would be taken off. I think it's been a learning in the field to keep kids on longer, and then as you have decades of this data that has built up, you see that you're getting benefits in other areas, including the upper body and the upper body strength, ability to feed, hand to mouth, pulmonary function, and in other areas. So that's some long-term data that certainly we'll want to collect on Vemorlan, but it's hard to speculate on that right now. Shabir?
Yeah, Jody, I agree. Thank you. So, what we know about the effects of steroids and the improvement in or stabilization in upper limb and respiratory function tends to occur around the time of loss of ambulation and a little bit forward. So perhaps at the age of about 12 or 14, once lung function drops below about 80%, probably the effects of steroids may not be as good as you'd want. However, there is still this perspective of the cardiac benefits of steroids. So I think that obviously needs further investigation. But I definitely see a value certainly around the time of losing ambulation to still be on the steroid and maybe a little bit longer beyond that. The cardiac, I think, needs a little bit more work.
I think I totally agree with you, Jody and Shabir. This is certainly something that we think about and we talk about. We have a lot of great information on starting steroids earlier and younger, but this is certainly something that we are continuing to look at closely and understand the effects of whether it be traditional steroids or Vemorlan in the adult population and what those long-term benefits could be. I think, as a bit of a pivot, we think about bone health being something that's incredibly important, particularly as our men with Duchenne go off their feet with that decreased muscle mass, all of these cumulative effects on bone health. So I wonder, could you tell us a little bit more about the work that you're doing with Leanne Ward there in Ottawa? She's certainly a friend of PPMD, and we're really thrilled to hear that you're working closely with her to understand the effects of Vemorlan on bone health. So maybe you could just touch on that a little bit more, and even maybe dive into when you think we might be able to see some of the initial data from that from that evaluation.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, Leanne's been wonderful. We're certainly working closely with her and actually looking at the data, in these days. So, what I could start by saying is that, what's different about the Malarone is that bone grows, right? You're growing. There isn't the stunting of growth. So that's certainly a key point that we're very clear is a benefit of the Malarone. In terms of the data we have at hand, and of course, I can only share with you because it's still preliminary. I'll give you a snapshot of where we are, is that, we have very low rates. We had one symptomatic foot fracture, but of course that's more common in children who are running around. And there was one symptomatic vertebral fracture to date. But we're still looking into the data. Obviously, we have to check all patients for potential asymptomatic fractures, but, it looks like the rate is much lower than you would expect typically from steroids.
That's great, Shabir. Thank you so much.
Sorry,
like I said, I'll just reiterate,
Sorry, I was just saying, you asked when the data would be available, right? So, I'm hoping mid to late April, we'd make an announcement in terms of safety. That's really our focus, to try to get that data out as quickly as possible. Late April, maybe early May is the time frame I'm thinking.
That's great. That's fantastic. Just to reiterate, that's something that we at PPMD are incredibly committed to, is understanding and improving the bone health for people living with Duchenne. So we're just thrilled that that's something that you're exploring so carefully and closely, with Dr. Ward being really one of the leaders in her field. So that's just fantastic. Let me see here. I'm just looking at the questions, see if there's anything else that we should dig into further. I know that we've really covered a ton of ground. So here's a really great question regarding just clinical trials and what access to vamorolone might look like in terms of commercial use and then access to clinical trials for other, potential therapeutic options. So do we think that, this is such a hard question, and I don't know that there's a straightforward answer. Do we think that someone who perhaps takes an FDA-approved, commercially available dose of vamorolone would still have the same level of access to clinical trials as their peers who are on things like prednisone or Emflaza? We think about access to gene therapy specifically. Do you have any commentary on what that might look like?
Yeah, it's a great question. Shabir, jump in here. Vemorlan is a dissociative steroid, so the goal is to be able to use it in place of a corticosteroid. I think we certainly will work with the other companies to understand their comfort in their clinical trial protocols to accommodate for vamorolone as the steroid preference of a family. And Shabir, do you want to say more about that?
Yeah, I think the view of the field is that the Duchenne will require a combination approach, right? And that's certainly front and center in our minds. So, we will build the database and we will try to collaborate where we can to establish the evidence that it can be used safely in combination with existing approved therapies. But I don't see a reason why, once it's approved, it should be regarded any differently to standard of care. We don't see anything, particularly in the behavior of the drug, that is, other than the safety profile being better, that would prevent, if trials are willing to accept standard of care, they should, I hope, accept Vemorlan in the future. But certainly, combination therapy is front and center in our mind, and we'll do what we can to assist that happening.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Jody and Shabir, for those additional comments. I think that it really speaks to the importance of, the family voice and the patient voice, and how we use our voices to advocate in a variety of means to ensure that as standards of care change, those changes are incorporated and accepted widely. So, I think that there will certainly be a lot of partnership to be done if and when we get to that point, and that's really exciting to think about too. One last question. I know that we're getting near. Go ahead, Jody.
Oh no, I just saw the gene therapy question come through. Do you want us to address this?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. There was a question about do clinical trials like gene therapy impact the accessibility of vamorolone? And this is a common question about how vamorolone would fit in with gene therapy, especially for the little kids. Vemorlan does not suppress the immune system, and we know this by examining the biomarkers indicative of immune suppression. And so for gene therapy, you use a high dose of steroids around the time of infusion to decrease the immune response. And Vemorlan doesn't function in this way, won't accomplish that goal for you. PPMD hosted a webinar a few weeks ago about weekend dosing of steroids, where Lee Sweeney made the comment that that high dose daily steroids, while potent anti-inflammatory medications, actually atrophy the muscle and destabilize the membrane. And what we believe is that vamorolone functions as a membrane stabilizer. And we have some preclinical data that has been published to support this in Duchenne and limb-girdle. And And given that, we could see a role for vamorolone in long-term in patients who have received gene therapy. Once the immediate threat of immune response has resolved, because even with gene therapy, you would need to treat the inflammation in the muscle. You're not going to eliminate that fully. So I think long-term, there could be a synergy there. And I hope that answers the question.
No, I think that's great.
Shabir, is there anything,
Jody?
Shabir, is there anything you want to add to that?
No.
Okay.
That's a good description. Thank you.
Okay.
Wonderful. And I think that, gene therapy is at the top of mind along with exciting developments like those that you've shared today with the development of Vemorlan. So I think, as a community, we're just we have so much of an appetite for these therapies as they come down the pipeline and get closer to being widely accessible to the community at large. So it's just really incredibly exciting. And I know that we're all looking very much forward to that Q2 update that we can expect from Santhera regarding Vision DMD and continued development of Vemorlan. So I unfortunately don't have additional time to take any more questions. I know that we were able to get through the vast majority of them. If you have additional questions, you can always reach out to us at PPMD or directly to Jody, and we can certainly follow up with you. Thank you so much to our speakers, Jody and Shabir, for joining us today and digging into all of this really, really exciting information about Vemorlan. And I think, we'll go ahead and we'll wrap up for today. So thanks so much to everybody for tuning in, and that will conclude today's webinar. Thanks so much.